And when we think about our Native American children, Alaska Native kids, Native Hawaiians, it really is ensuring that those most vulnerable have the protections that we need. And so, as you have outlined, this bill and the focus on whether it's grant programs for treatment and recovery of child abuse and neglect victims, seeking to modernize the grant programs for better implementation through centralized training, technical assistance through a National Resource Center. These are all matters that are very important as we're dealing with issues related to family violence. We've been doing some good things in this committee when it comes to protecting Native children. We had our Alice Spotted Bear and Walter Soboleff Commission on Native Children, funding for the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Tawahi Initiative, legislation that we have advanced supporting the related infrastructure for public safety in Native communities. So much good, and I'm pleased that with moving this through today, we'll continue on that good effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Are there any other members wishing to make an opening statement? Senator Lujan.
Chair Schatz, thank you so very much. And I also want to say thank you to our Vice Chair, Chairman Murkowski, for the opportunity to address the committee today to discuss the importance of protecting Native American voting rights. And I also thank you for advancing the Native American Child Protection Act, which I am the proud sponsor of in the Senate. Voting is a fundamental and sacred right that is a cornerstone of our democracy. But for too long, barriers have stood in the way of Native Americans accessing the ballot box and making their voices heard. This is unacceptable. And I'm grateful for the committee's attention to this critical issue, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to find solutions. It's also an honor to introduce Jacqueline De Leon, an enrolled member of the Isleta Pueblo in New Mexico and staff attorney for the Native American Rights Fund. Ms. De Leon's leadership and expertise is incredibly valued, and she is a strong partner of mine in building support for the Native American Voting Rights Act that I introduced. Just last week, Ms. De Leon testified before the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on the Constitution, and throughout her career, she has spent considerable time working with members of Congress to advance voting rights issues for Native Americans. The committee knows that voter suppression efforts across the country are making it harder for Americans to vote, especially for Native American voters, which Ms. De Leon will discuss today. That is why I introduced the Native American voting rights with the support of Chair Schatz and other members of this committee, and why I worked to secure the inclusion of this legislation in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act with the support of Senator Leahy. As the last minority and political group to be afforded the right to vote in the United States, Native Americans have had to consistently fight for access to the ballot. I'm proud to lead this legislation that is part of this civil rights legacy and would bring long overdue progress to protecting voting rights that Native Americans and tribal nations have worked so hard to secure and defend. Our democracy is at stake, and we have a moral imperative to act to ensure that Native Americans have their voices heard in our electoral process and combat the barriers that exist. The Native American Voting Rights Act would ensure that there are early voting, registration, drop boxes, and polling sites on tribal lands, and permit tribal governments to designate tribal buildings for these purposes. It would also require states and precincts to accept tribal IDs as valid forms of voter identification and require tribal consultation, notice, and consent before states and precincts make changes that reduce access to the ballot on tribal lands. The bill would also establish a $10 million grant program to help states establish a Native American voting rights task force like the one we have in New Mexico to increase coordination among states and local tribal governments. So I look forward to the testimony today, to the conversation, and to being able to move these legislative initiatives forward. Thank you all. And again, Ms. De Leon, we welcome you to the committee, and I yield back, Mr. Schatz.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Any other members wishing to make an opening statement on H.R. 1688? If not, I'll entertain a motion to consider H.R. 1688. So moved. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Is there a discussion on the bill? Hearing none, those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, H.R. 1688 passes. I want to thank the members for getting the business of our committee completed expeditiously today. I appreciate all of everyone's time, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make technical and conforming changes. There being no objections or further business before the committee, this business meeting is adjourned. And we're back. Good afternoon. During today's oversight hearing titled Voting Matters in Native Communities, we will examine the American Indian and Alaska Native voter experience, including ongoing challenges to exercising the right to vote in Indian country. We will also examine the less formally documented Native Hawaiian voter experience for the first time in this committee's history. The legacy of Native American voter suppression is a stain on our country's democracy. Even after gaining citizenship in 1924, American Indians and Alaska Natives did not have full access to the ballot box. In fact, it wasn't until 1962, not until 1962, that all states fully guaranteed voting rights for Native Americans. The 1965 Voting Rights Act strengthened these rights, and the 1975 amendment to the act included further protections for language assistance and translation of voting materials. And yet, 50 years later, Native Americans continue to experience voter discrimination and unjust behavior at the ballot box. In his testimony before the Judiciary Committee hearing on Native voting rights last week, which I'll enter into the record, Navajo Nation President Nez described barriers like the elimination of in-person polling locations on the reservation, distant voter registration sites, all-mail voting systems, lack of language assistance for Navajo-only speakers, and racial gerrymandering. Unfortunately, Navajo's case is not unique in Indian country. Native voters in states across the country continue to be disproportionately affected by these types of voter suppression efforts. That simply cannot stand. Congress must take action to counterbalance this historical and ongoing discrimination. We cannot allow our most fundamental right, the right to vote, to be stripped from Native Americans. Last week, the Senate had the opportunity to take action by passing the Freedom to Vote Act, which contains key reforms in the Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021, but that bill was blocked. We in Congress must stay vigilant and keep up the fight to protect the franchise, especially for communities of color. And as members of the Indian Affairs Committee, we owe a particular duty to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians to ensure that their votes are counted, not discounted, because voting is sacred and Native votes matter. Before I turn to the Vice Chair, I'd like to welcome and extend my aloha to Mr. Na'alehu Anthony and thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing the unique perspectives that each of you bring to this conversation. Vice Chair Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, before that, could I ask to be recorded present and for the vote as I was out and they'll...
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing at this time on this important matter. When we think about the right to vote, it is clear. This is a freedom. This is one that is critical and important to American democracy. And the right to vote, we know, has evolved tremendously over time, including with respect to the voting rights of our First Peoples. American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians deserve an equal opportunity to participate in our American electoral system and political process, period. There has to be that equal opportunity. I've been inspired by the long and storied history of how Native Americans have fought to participate in and improve our nation through the democratic process. This is part of what we have seen in Alaska, where we're proud to share the legacy and the contributions of early Alaska Native civil and voting rights leaders, including Elizabeth Peratrovich. You may have seen her honored on dollar coins in our currency. She is getting that recognition that is due, but our nation has not always supported or honored such leaders. As our witnesses will note in their testimony, in Alaska's 1915 Territorial Act, Alaska Natives were denied citizenship unless they could prove through individual examinations that they had abandoned, quote, any tribal customs or relationship, close quote, and had adopted the habits of a civilized life. Alaska's territorial legislature passed a literacy test which disenfranchised Alaska Natives who had gained citizenship in 1924, but they adopted this literacy test in our state's constitution. Not a good part of our state's history. Native civil rights leaders have worked to overcome obstacles to participation, including deliberate efforts by state legislatures to deny Native Americans the right to vote through policies such as the literacy tests, or sometimes even forcing Native peoples to abandon their cultures. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally made the promise to Native Americans that they would have full legal access to voting. The Voting Rights Act was pivotal in moving our country out of the dark Jim Crow era of American history, but that voting rights legislation, we know, was expanded several times, including back in 1975 to protect language minorities. So with this hearing today, we've got an opportunity, and you note, Mr. Chairman, that this follows on the hearing that they had last week in Senate Judiciary, but this is our opportunity as a committee to hear from Native people about the issues that continue to pose barriers to voting. And these can include things like distance from government offices, geographical isolation, lack of roads, the digital divide, lower educational attainment, socioeconomic conditions, and certainly discrimination. Some of the barriers relate to a lack of basic infrastructure in our Native communities. I know we're trying to get through the process the bipartisan infrastructure bill that will help us in our rural communities, most certainly. But existing disparities continue to affect access to services and can pose obstacles to voting. Several of my colleagues, including Senator Lujan, who just spoke previously, have introduced specific legislation on Native American voting rights that I think attempts to address some of the issues that are affecting Native voting access. So I hope that through this oversight hearing today, we're able to more closely examine that bill through the lens of the Indian Affairs Committee. I'm specifically looking forward to hearing about how the Native voting rights legislation might be implemented, funded, and actually work on the ground. We've got a good panel in front of us today, and we thank them for joining us, but I want to give a particular welcome to Julie Kitka, who is the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, who's going to be providing testimony on this very important matter today. She is no stranger to this committee, and she is clearly one that we will want to listen to in this very important discussion. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair Murkowski. Are there any other members wishing to make an opening statement? We are going to introduce all of the testifiers in order, but I'd like Senator Cortez Masto to introduce her guest.
Thank you, Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Murkowski, for holding this important hearing today. And I am so excited to be able to introduce one of today's witnesses, Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribal Chairwoman Janet Davis. She's an elected leader. She is a community advocate, a former elementary school teacher. Chairwoman Davis has been an active member of the Native community in Nevada for decades. She has been a particularly strong champion for voting rights for Native American voters located in Nevada. During the 2016 presidential election, Chairwoman Davis advocated for the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe in federal court, and in doing so successfully helped establish a new polling place on the reservation. Last year, during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, Chairwoman Davis did all she could to encourage Native Americans in Nevada to participate in the election. She canvassed for her local community, she helped fellow tribal members register to vote, and she ensured that tribal members worked the polls during the election. As members of Congress, we should be doing everything possible to encourage participation in the democratic process and ensure that all eligible voters, including Native American voters, are able to exercise their right to cast a ballot, just as Chairwoman Davis has done for her community. So I hope my colleagues join me in welcoming Chairwoman Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Cantwell has an opening statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and Vice Chair Murkowski for holding this important hearing, and thank all our witnesses for participating. I originally thought that Fawn Sharp from our state, former chair of the National Congress of American Indians, former chair of the Quinault tribe, was going to be with us, but I'm sure she'll be submitting information. Washington State has been a leader in the accessibility and security elections, and we've had record turnouts, sometimes as high as 83 or 84%. And so it's imperative, I believe, that legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act or the Native American Voting Rights Act that Senator Lujan recently introduced are important proposals. Tribal communities not only need easier access to voting, but they need to feel that their ballots are secure. The state of Washington has a comprehensive voting rights, and much of that has been possible because of the tireless work and advocacy of these issues by the tribal leaders in my state. So I just want to thank them for that. In 2019, the Washington legislature passed a similar bill to the one we are discussing today, the Native American Voting Rights Act of Washington. This bill helped increase voter registration and turnout in Native communities by expanding voter services, improving accessibility on tribal lands, and maintaining an incredibly safe and secure system. And just yesterday, we were excited to know that now our former, as of yesterday, Republican Secretary of State Kim Wyman may be joining the Biden administration to lead election securities and Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency. I hope if this is the case that Kim will bridge the gap in other states for some of the things that we've been able to do in the state of Washington and help with these issues. There's nothing more important than giving people the right to vote, making sure those votes are secure, and increasing voter participation. And I'm so happy that this focus should be not a partisan issue, but really one that's important to the geography of all Americans, but some who live in some of the most remote parts of the United States. So I hope that we will work with all of our colleagues to make sure that this kind of improvement to our system is implemented. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now turn to our witnesses. Senator Cortez Masto introduced Ms. Janet Davis. Senator Murkowski had introduced Ms. Julie Kitka, and Senator Lujan had introduced Ms. Jacqueline De Leon. We also have the Honorable Aaron Payment, Secretary of the National Congress of American Indians. We have Professor Patty Ferguson Bonney, Director of Indian Legal Clinic, Arizona State University, and Mr. Naalehu Anthony, Community Advocate and Principal of Paliku Films in Honolulu, Hawaii. And we'll start with Ms. Davis. Please proceed with your testimony. And since we have 6 of us, please try to confine your remarks to 5 minutes or less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, for the introduction. New Chairwoman Janet Davis, me Naniat. New Kiwi Dakota. Good afternoon. Chairwoman Janet Davis here from the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe in Nevada. I know how important it is for Native people to vote. For the following reasons: to represent our Native views, to bring a diversified view to elections, to honor our ancestors and those fighting to have our right to vote recognized. We as Native people, we take political action by casting our vote. Through this, we make sure federal government fulfills its trust obligation to us. Tribes across the nation have some of the greatest needs for healthcare, housing, employment, education, and human services. We can address these issues. We know change is possible through voting and political actions. We let the politicians know that we are here, we vote, and we count. Voting restrictions and discriminatory laws discourage potential voters from wanting to vote. Historically, tribes and voters have been blocked from voting. The natives were the last class of people to get the right to vote. Old people know what the battles were to earn that right. They are our biggest voting group on the reservation. Young people don't know the battles. It's been a challenge to get them educated on the importance to voting. Native voters face limitations to polling locations. Most are located off reservation and usually great distances from our reservations. The poll workers are usually non-Native and sometimes not very welcoming. County clerks do not reach out to tribes to employ poll workers. We as tribal people need to get out our Native people interested and get them to apply. There is a great need for voting rights protections to provide for equal access to voting. Our tribe, along with the Walker River Paiute tribe, filed a federal lawsuit in 2016 requesting that we have a polling location on our reservation as well as early voting on our reservation. If there were federal voting right protections that allowed for equal voting rights, it would be so much easier for all to vote. Here in Nevada, voters are allowed to vote via of mail or at the polling location. The state legislature also passed legislation that will allow for all reservations to request a voting location on the reservations. We are still working to educate tribes on what that will take. In last year's general election, a number of tribes did have drop boxes located on tribal lands. What we're finding out is that county clerks are not familiar with the laws or their responsibilities to assist the tribes. What I see is that tribes need legal assistance in dealing with voting rights. Each tribe should not have to threaten a lawsuit for equal voting rights. We were lucky to have 4 Directions assist our tribes with a 2016 lawsuit. It also took time to gather information from our voters and compile statistics. This takes time and money that tribes don't have. With states passing laws to limit and hinder voting by natives, there is a great need for congressional action. The state legislators are seeing the strength in the native vote, which they haven't seen before. Native grassroots groups are banding together and are becoming voting blocs. Our reservation people are voters, and that's mainly due to us having our own polling location on our reservation, and all of our native people are poll workers. We now have a good working relationship with our county clerk. True representation for Native voters and communities means the tribal voters find it easy to register to vote and have easy access to a voting location. It means that Native people are working the polls and are welcoming to Native voters. What would the protections in Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021 mean to us as Native voters? It would mean that the federal government is meeting its trust responsibility to protect and promote Native Americans' exercise of their constitutionally guaranteed right to vote, including the right to register to vote and the ability to access all mechanisms for voting. To establish tribal administrative review procedures for a specific subset of state actions that have been used to restrict access to the polls on Indian lands. To expand voter registration under the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 to cover federal facilities. To afford equal treatment to forms of identification unique to Indian tribes and their members. To ensure Indians and Alaskan Natives experiencing homelessness, housing insecurity, or lacking residential mail pickup and delivery can pool resources to pick up and return ballots. To clarify the obligation of states and political subdivisions regarding the provision of translated voting materials for American Indians and Alaskan Natives under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 52 U.S.C. 10503. To provide tribal leaders with a direct pathway to request federal election observers and to allow public access to the reports of those election observers. To study the prevalence of non-traditional or non-existent mailing addresses in Native communities and identify solutions to voter access that arise from the lack of an address, and to direct the Department of Justice to consult on an annual basis the Indian tribes on issues related to voting. This is an act that needs to be passed before the next election. Tribes also need funding to help enforce the initiatives set forth in this act. In Nevada, we are working to be proactive in making sure that all our people have fair and easy access to the polls. We want our people working the polls on and off the reservation. There are so many opportunities that we have once we vote. Our voices become stronger when working to pass state legislation. An example of this is, and we are proud to say that we worked to pass AB 262, a tuition waiver bill that allows our Native Nevadan students to attend state colleges and universities tuition-free. We also become more involved at all levels of state government as voters are listened to. Also, the Nevada State Legislature passed Senate Bill 492 to provide Indian tribes with the ability to request a polling location either for early voting or election day on Indian reservation or colonies to improve access to elections. Furthermore, Assembly Bill 137 established once a polling location is established, it must continue to serve as a polling location for future elections. That is the power of Native voting. Thank you all for listening today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Davis. And now we have Julie Kitka, the president of AFN.
Good afternoon. Aloha, Chairman Schatz and Vice Chairwoman Murkowski and members of the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Julie Kitka, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, or AFN. Established in 1966 by our early leaders to achieve a fair and just settlement of Aboriginal land claims, AFN is the oldest and largest statewide Native organization in Alaska and counts as our members nearly half the federally recognized tribes in our country, and our regional and village corporations, and formed under our land claims and all the regional nonprofit tribal consortium and nonprofits administrating programs under the Indian Self-Determination Act. Having worked to overcome the decades-long disenfranchisement of Alaska Native voters, AFN is well positioned to help the committee understand the continuing need to protect the foundational rights of Alaska Natives to express their decisions in voting. Before turning to the topic of today's hearing, I want to remind the committee that we're still dealing with unprecedented change going on in our lives. Rapid change has been a key part of our lives for a number of decades, and this change and disruption continues. Working together with our congressional delegation and others, we have made lasting improvements, extending life expectancy, reducing poverty, increasing access to life-saving health care, and building the capacity to stand on our own 2 feet. I want to express my deepest appreciation for the federal help we have received to try and combat the pandemic and the economic collapse which affects us all. The acceleration of technological change, while with many benefits, still exacerbates inequities, especially in our rural, remote communities. Your willingness to craft solutions with this understanding would be greatly appreciated. Further, I take to heart the national policy of reinvigorating our country and strengthening our infrastructure and democracy to deal with increasing competition across the world. Voting rights legislation, to me, is a foundation to strengthen democracy and the rule of law. I also want to thank you, Senator Murkowski, for recognizing Elizabeth Pradovich. She and her husband, Roy, were a team, and they are icons in our state on overcoming discrimination and voting rights. And sometimes we sometimes think about Elizabeth Pradovich as part of our history, but I could remember meeting with her husband, Roy, when he was the superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he'd have behind his desk pictures of his grandkids, and even put my daughter up there with his grandkids. So Elizabeth Pradovich and her impacts and her husband and all the other people that supported her and helped her is our current history. It is not old. Today, I want to focus on my testimony on 4 issues. First, I want to dispel the false narrative that voting rights violations are a thing of the past in Alaska and attributable to previous administrations. The facts, evidence, and judicial decisions say otherwise and point to the role of current election officials in those violations. Every successful enforcement action on behalf of Alaska Natives under the Voting Rights Act in the past quarter century has occurred because of violations which occurred in whole or in part of the current leadership of the Alaska Division of Elections has been in place. This includes the NIC litigation on behalf of the Yupik-speaking villages in the Bethel area, as well as the Yupik-speaking villages in Dillingham and other regions, and the Gwich'in-speaking villages in the Yukon-Koyukuk region. More regions of Alaska are currently designated for federal observers under the Voting Rights Act than in the remainder of the United States because of those violations. Second, I want to briefly explain how Alaska's election director has exercised discretionary authority under Alaska law to impede equal access of Alaska Natives to voting opportunities. Those discretionary acts have included seeking to close in-person voting locations in Alaska Native villages, such as designating some villages permanent absentee voting sites, proposing vote by mail despite language and illiteracy barriers that require in-person bilingual assistance for elders to cast effective ballots. Under the current Director's Watch Federal Help America Vote Act funds designated for uses including language assistance languished in interest-bearing accounts while the director prioritized opening a new elections office in the small non-native community of Wasilla just outside of Anchorage. Rural election workers were required to be volunteers and paid a stipend of $100, or about 15 cents an hour, versus urban election workers who were hired and paid $15 an hour. Native villages for early voting sites at the same time early voting locations proliferated in the predominantly non-native urban areas. Only after AFN intervened on behalf of these villages and engaged in self-help to open these locations did the director acquisition. Third, I want to emphasize that the pre-clearance requirement of Section 5 stopped voting discrimination before it occurred in Alaska. The straightforward, cost-effective, and timely pre-clearance mechanism has been replaced by years of disenfranchisement of Alaska Natives voters while discriminatory practices have been challenged in the courts. Alaska has incurred a monetary price in the millions of dollars to pay for these discriminatory practices, but the far greater cost has been to the thousands of Alaska Natives disenfranchised while voting cases wound their way through the courts. Fourth, I want to emphasize that these bills are needed to address Alaska's present and ongoing discrimination against Alaska Natives. This is not the time for half measures that will leave Alaska Native voters without the full protections guaranteed the Constitution and the broad plenary powers that Congress has to regulate its relations with federally recognized tribes through free and equal access to the political process. These bills are complementary provisions that the Senate must pass immediately. Anything short of passage of both would reflect a lack of commitment to eradicating once and for all the first generation voting barriers that Alaska Natives voters face every day. Protecting the right to vote is not a partisan issue. It's a fundamental civil rights issue for Alaska Natives. Everyone suffers. An elected government has less legitimacy each time an Alaska Native is prevented from registering to vote or is turned away at the polls. Now is time to act. Now is the time to pass S4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, and Title III of that bill, NAVRA, which is codenamed after a great Alaska Native civil rights leader, Elizabeth Bradovich. Thank you for your attention and your commitment to making voting fully accessible to Alaska Natives and other voters in Indian country. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you may have now or later in writing following the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kitka. Now we have Jacqueline De Leon, staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado.
Thank you, Senator Lujan, for that kind introduction and for championing NAVRA. And thank you, Chairman Schatz and Vice Chair Murkowski, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Jacqueline De Leon. I'm a member of the Asleta Pueblo, and I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, known as NARF, the nation's largest and oldest nonprofit dedicated to advancing the rights of Native Americans. My testimony will focus on the need to pass the Native American Voting Rights Act and to fully restore the Voting Rights Act due to ongoing present-day neglect and racial discrimination that is stripping Native Americans of their political power. In 2018, the Native American Voting Rights Coalition completed field hearings across Indian country, which I co-led. We heard from approximately 125 witnesses about voting in federal and state elections. Our findings are extensively documented in a report which I have submitted to this committee. I'm humbled to be carrying their stories, tears, and demand for action with me today. Today, many Native American reservations are rural, distant from the nearest off-reservation border town because of official policies to forcibly remove and segregate Natives on remote and undesirable land. Travel to voting services, DMVs, and post offices can be over 100 miles away. Due to ongoing discrimination and governmental neglect, many Native Americans live in overcrowded homes that do not have addresses, do not receive mail, and are located on dirt roads that can be impassable in wintry November. The Native American Voting Rights Act, championed in the House by two Native members, Republican Tom Cole and Democrat Sharice Davids, would address the glaring structural deficiencies facing Native communities by mandating on-reservation voting services and accommodations for homes that do not receive mail delivery and do not have residential addresses. It would also ensure access by requiring services be equitable on and off reservations. NARF has also successfully brought Native American voting rights cases in the last 4 years, including challenges to North Dakota's voter ID law that required a residential address on IDs when the state knew that there were homes on the Native American reservations that did not have addresses on them. A challenge to Montana's ballot collection ban when tribes in Montana do not have residential mail delivery. A challenge to Alaska's witness signature requirement during a pandemic, when elderly and single mothers would have had to break quarantine in order to comply. 20 lawsuit challenging the refusal to open an in-person polling location on the Blackfeet Reservation. I'd like to pause on that last case. Pend Oreille County chose to keep in-person voting at their county seat, which ensured access for the over 90% white residents, but attempted to deny in-person voting to Blackfeet tribal members who do not get mail delivered to their homes and would have had to travel 120 miles to vote. Indeed, relying upon the 14th and 15th Amendments and the VRA, Native American voters have filed nearly 100 lawsuits with a success rate of over 90%. The cases have been litigated in front of judges appointed by Republican and Democratic presidents. In short, the facts are so bad, we nearly always win. Yet the Supreme Court's hostility towards voting rights imperils the ability of Native litigants to get the relief they deserve. In Shelby County v. Holder, the court suspended Section 5, robbing Native voters in Arizona, Alaska, parts of South Dakota, and North Carolina from pre-clearance protections. And in Brnovich v. DNC, the Supreme Court upheld 2 voting restrictions that had a disparate impact on Native American voters, contrary to the express purpose of Section 2. The need for federal action is urgent and compelling. For example, just last year, tribes and GOTV organizations successfully challenged a ballot collection ban in Montana under the state's right to vote provision. Yet the legislature passed another ballot collection ban this year in a move that the Montana Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights described as intentional discrimination that will increase barriers to voters for Native Americans on reservations in Montana. Finally, NARF has collected extensive evidence of the racism faced by Native American voters in recent years by voting officials. In 2018, a San Juan County clerk in Utah committed fraud and backdated a false complaint against a Native American candidate. Less than 10 years ago in South Dakota, Native American voters were humiliated and forced to vote out of a chicken coop. And this year, county officials spent $180,000 fighting against providing early voting on the Pasquayaqui Reservation. I urge this committee to do the necessary work of investigating and recording these injustices, to fully restore the Voting Rights Act, and to pass the Native American Voting Rights Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Honorable Aaron Payment, Secretary of the National Congress of American Indians.
Good afternoon, Chair Schatz, Vice Chair Murkowski, and members of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Our National Congress of American Indians president could not be with us today, Fawn Sharp. She's getting a COVID test in the very narrow window that you have to do that in order for us to, for her to represent us at COP26. She's on her way there. So, but on behalf of NCAI, I would like to thank you for holding this hearing today to discuss the critically important issue of voting rights. My name is Dr. Aaron Payment, Chairperson of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe and the Secretary of the National Congress of American Indians. In my 20s, I was a county deputy registrar to register others to vote and set up voter registration in tribal offices. I'm also heavily involved in NCAI's partnerships with Native Vote and Get Out to Vote in a nonpartisan way. We greatly appreciate the committee holding this important hearing to protect voting rights for all Native Americans. This is timely with the introduction of the Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021 and the new John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Congress has a trust responsibility to enact voting rights legislation to protect constitutionally guaranteed rights of Natives to vote. Despite being indigenous sovereigns in what is now the U.S., Natives were the last people to be granted the right to vote in 1924. Even then, it was 3 decades later before all Natives were able to fully participate in state elections. While some progress has been made, today there are strong forces preventing our people from fully participating in the political process. These barriers include geographic isolation, poorly maintained roads, housing insecurity, depressed economic conditions, and discrimination. The obstacles are exacerbated by the growing number of laws across the country seeking to purge voter information, limit voter registration, create language and residency barriers, and other mechanisms to produce discriminatory outcomes. The ability to vote is a fundamental right and the foundational principle of any democracy. For many, barriers make it impractical or even impossible to vote. I'm going to use my brief time with you to highlight that no matter where we live, what ID cards we have, or what language we speak, Native people should have fair and equal access to voting. Due to the lack of residential mail delivery in some rural communities, poor roads, and prevalence of homes that do not have addresses, it's harder for Natives to register, receive an absentee ballot, and reach the polls. The most direct way to ensure a more equitable access is a federal mandate providing for on-reservation polling places and registration opportunities. Allowing tribes to designate a building whose address can be used to register, pick up, and drop off a ballot would also help tremendously. Protections and provisions of this sort are included in the Native American Voting Rights Act, which was introduced by Senator Lujan. Thank you, Senator Lujan, for introducing legislation that has broad support across Indian country. The same piece of legislation was introduced in the bipartisan fashion in the House of Representatives by Representatives Tom Cole and Sharice Davids, who are the co-chairs of the Congressional Native Caucus. For many years, for many people, voting participation is not possible due to overly restrictive voter ID requirements. Studies have shown that photo ID requirements in particular have had a chilling effect on Native voting turnout. Reasons for this are varied, but in short, for many Native people, merely getting to the DMV or Secretary of State means leaving the reservation and in many cases having to travel up to 100 miles. These costs are prohibitive for many. Even when Native people get registered to vote, get to the polls, and provide appropriate ID, language barriers remain intact for the more than 350,000 speakers of more than 175 Native languages. Our Native speakers are the keepers of our histories, our traditions, and our culture, but all too often are rejected at the polls. Again, legislation such as the Native American Voting Rights Act addresses these ID requirements and language barriers with simple, common sense solutions like permitting individuals to vote with a tribal card and allowing tribes to request voter registration and ballot materials be available in their own languages. I urge this committee and all Congress to act to ensure that the voting rights across the country are uniformly protected for everyone. Please enact legislation with the protections and provisions including in the Native American Voting Rights Act. We are strongest as a democracy when we are all participating by voting. Thank you to the Senate Indian Affairs Committee for this opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have, including some statistics, updated statistics on the number of Native Americans and those who are registered and who could be registered to vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Professor Patty Ferguson Bonney, Director of Indian Legal Clinic at Arizona State University.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairwoman Murkowski, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. The Indian Legal Clinic coordinates the Arizona Native Vote Election Protection Project, a nonpartisan effort to protect Native American voting rights. We have assisted hundreds of voters through our Election Day volunteer program and hotline. Our program has been successful because of support from and collaboration with local tribes committed to protecting the vote, such as the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation, the Ak-Chin Indian Community, and organizations such as the Intertribal Council of Arizona. On behalf of tribal clients, I have also litigated Section 2 cases involving redistricting, restrictive voting laws, early voting access, and language compliance under Section 203. To understand Native American voting challenges, one must recognize the vast differences in experiences, opportunities, and realities facing on-reservation voters. Isolating conditions such as language, socioeconomic disparities, lack of access to transportation, lack of residential addresses, lack of access to mail, the digital divide, and distance are just some of the factors that impede access to the polls and participation in the political process. Arizona and its election policies fail to consider and often exploit these realities, thus suppressing the vote through ID requirements, long distances to early and election day voting sites, inadequate language assistance, bans on ballot assistance, and policies that needlessly discard ballots due to strict technicalities. In short, these factors create a complicated maze that voters must navigate, with no guarantee that reaching the end means that your vote will be counted. Governmental neglect has led to lack of standardized addresses and lack of access to mail delivery that further impact tribal populations. Vote by mail, for example, is not a simple or easy task. Only 18% of tribal voters outside of Maricopa and Pima counties have a physical address and receive mail at home. Most rely on the limited number of P.O. boxes in Indian country. Often these boxes are far away and open for limited days and hours. While most voters in Arizona vote by mail, a method that does not require voters to show ID, this method of voting is not accessible to Native Americans. Further, non-traditional addresses make complying with Arizona's voter ID law more difficult. Tribal IDs are wrongly rejected in each election due to insufficient poll worker training or because of problems with non-standard addresses. For example, prior to the 2020 election, 2,000 voters in Apache County were placed in suspense due to non-traditional addresses. Also, counties fail to place tribal citizens in the correct precinct, which results in their ballots being discarded, or it results in them being turned away without voting, or redirected to a polling location which could be over 30 minutes away. Native Americans also do not have equal access to voter registration. Many voters must travel long distances off reservation to register to vote, in some cases more than 95 miles one way. And while online voter registration is possible for off-reservation voters, this option is limited for on-reservation voters. Many reservation voters lack telecommunication infrastructure to access the internet. And even if the voter has internet access, the state does not allow tribal IDs to be used to register to vote online. We also know in Arizona that Native Americans have an unequal access to in-person early voting. While every county has in-person early voting, off-reservation, there are limited opportunities for in-person early voting on reservation. If offered at all, in-person early voting could be limited to a few hours on 1 or 2 days. For example, the Hopi tribe had a total of 4 hours of in-person early voting, while off-reservation voters had 162 hours. And members of the Kaibab Paiute tribe had to travel 280 miles one way to participate in in-person early voting. Post-Shelby, Pima County closed the Pasquayaki early voting location. The tribe repeatedly requested that the county reopen the site. Since they closed the site, it required voters to travel over 2 hours by bus to cast an early ballot. As you heard Ms. DeLeon say, the cost to operate the early voting site was only $5,000, but the county spent over $180,000 to defend its decision to close the polling location. Prior to Shelby County, covered jurisdictions would have to consider whether a voting law would have a negative impact on minority voters. This is no longer the case. Legislation affecting voting often appears neutral with the stated goal of preventing voter fraud. Yet the effect of these laws is not added security. The effect is added layers of suppression. Without Section 5's protection and a workable Section 2 standard, voting laws and practices will continue to be adopted that suppress the Native American vote. I want to remind the committee that Congress has a duty to fulfill its unique trust obligation, including in matters of voting. As Justice Kagan said in her dissent in Bronovich, we are in an era of voting rights retrenchment, with too many states and localities are restricting access to voting in ways that will predictably deprive members of minority groups of equal access to the ballot box. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much. It now gives me pleasure and pride to introduce my friend, Mr. Na'alehu Anthony, principal of Paliku Films. Mr. Anthony.
Aloha Keneko Shots, Keneko Murkowski, I'm in Alala o ke Komike, o Val o Na'alehu Anthony, Anohova ma Ka'aava, ma ke Mokupuni o Oahu, Nui ko mahalo ya o ko Pakahi a Pau, no ke ma minuke, no ke kumuhana ko iloa. Aloha Chair Brian Schatz, Vice Chair Lisa Murkowski, and committee members. My name is Na'alehu Anthony, and I come from Ka'aava on the island of Oahu. Mahalo for the opportunity to provide testimony on voting matters in Native communities. The stakes are high across the country, and while there are numerous examples in the continental 48 that require your thoughtful consideration, my testimony is offered to highlight the unique perspectives that we face as Native Hawaiians in our ancestral lands. He ali'i ka'aina a he kawa ke kanaka. The land is the chief and we are its servants. This olalo no'eau comes to us from our ancestors. We've been caretakers of this place we call Hawaii for more than 1,000 years, and over that time, the responsibilities that we have taken left an undeniable imprint on the trajectory of this place and an essential connection that should not be severed. And yet, over the last 200 years, we've shared the common story with other Native peoples testifying today of cultural and physical genocide, with our lands and people no longer cared for by a Hawaiian governing entity, and instead assimilated into the US mainstream. Our voice in the democratic process has dwindled. I fear that without our engagement in voting, and therefore standing with the voice of authority in government, the worldview that has persisted here will no longer be the dominant one of this place. The future story with Native Hawaiians in it will be in jeopardy if we can no longer see ourselves in the reflection of that molelo, that story. There is an insidious belief in the politics of Hawaii. Hawaiians simply don't vote. I've heard it many times, and we don't actually know the truth to that statement because our political organizers lack quality data to help us truly understand voting habits and sentiment towards electoral politics amongst our Native Hawaiian community. The possibility of holding Hawaiian-only elections disappeared in 1999 with the ruling in Rice v. Cayetano, which also took away our ability to understand who amongst our majority mixed-race Hawaiian community vote with their Hawaiian identity in mind. Our grassroots organizations lack the research budgets necessary to better understand who of those community members vote or do not vote, and therefore how we might be able to activate and inspire them. We would deeply appreciate the help of this committee to improve our access to data that will help inform and empower our community. Underrepresented in local, statewide, and national politics, Hawaiian interests, like those of many other Native peoples, have been marginalized, ignored, or actively opposed time and time again. And so one might ask, if voting changes nothing for us, why bother? The threshold for why bother is high, not only due to the lack of faith in government, but also because of the extraordinary social and economic pressures our communities are under. We live in a place where virtually everything is imported. We have become accustomed to shipping most of our food in, even though these islands fed close to 1 million people before the point of Western contact. We have some of the highest costs for everything here, from milk and bread to utilities like electricity. One of the most troubling benchmarks is the median cost of a single-family home, now more than $1 million on the island where I live, Oahu. The economists tell us that the qualifying income for $1 million median home would be just about $140,000 a year. Through the local economic data for Native Hawaiian households is not as readily available as we would like. Data from the Census Bureau indicates that median household income for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders nationwide was just under $67,000. Nationally, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make only half the money they'd need to afford a house on Oahu. That statistic alone threatens our ability for Native Hawaiians to vote in Hawaii, and the income figures quoted above are pre-pandemic, not yet reflecting the outsized economic burden COVID-19 has had in our community. Far too many of us have fallen through the cracks, and increasingly more and more of us find it easier to pack up and leave for other states than slip deeper and deeper into debt in an attempt to remain in our ancestral home. This phenomena has become even more acute with the pandemic as Hawaii has become the lifeboat for the extremely wealthy seeking relative safety of the islands in our low COVID rates. Houses are still being bought sight unseen with cash from those who can now work remotely. Put simply, we're being forced to leave due to the high costs required to persist here. This is problematic as there are simply fewer of us to vote in Hawaii elections, and those of us who remain are under increasing pressure to just make it every day. Before the 2020 election, Hawaii saw 2 decades of voter turnout with percentages in the 30s and 40s, some of the lowest turnout in the United States. That figure alone should cause concern for this committee. Individuals and communities who lack faith and engagement with the established political system seek other avenues to make their voices heard, as our community has with increasing visibility and effect in recent years. A healthy democracy requires representation, and we as Native Hawaiians need our perspectives weighed and counted so that we may, once again, take on the kuleana, the responsibility for this place we call home. I thank you for your time today and look forward to any questions that you might have. Aloha.
Mahalo. Vice Chair Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all those who have joined the committee here this afternoon and for sharing as you have. I want to start my questions directed to you, Julie Kitka. Julie, thank you for your leadership at AFN. You have a decades-long tenure there that, again, I've mentioned to the committee, you're no stranger to the committee here, but you're also no stranger to these issues. You have worked through so many issues of discrimination as they relate to Alaska Native peoples, and certainly when it comes to the voting rights issues, you have been engaged in this for many, many years, and I want to thank you for your efforts and then those of so many Alaska Native leaders that have worked hard to combat the disenfranchisement of Alaska Native votes. Your testimony is very very thorough, and I think shares well that the concern that voting rights violations, unfortunately, are not a thing of the past, as you have outlined. There are some differences, I would suppose, on the need for when we're talking about federal voting rights legislation. There's some differences of opinion on whether or not one sees a role for the federal government in the administration of state elections. It's usually your states that set the rules, and the elections are run at the local level. But Julie, in your statement, and you've repeated it here today, it's really quite telling to know that more regions of Alaska are currently designated for federal observers under the Voting Rights Act than in the remainder of the United States. So it was an important thing to include as part of the record. If you can share with the committee, please, how the Section 5 preclearance provisions in the Voting Rights Act worked to stop voting discrimination in Alaska. I think one of the things that we're trying to do here is to prevent these issues of discrimination in the first place. So can you speak to Section 5 of the
Yes,
Voting
I
Rights
can
Act?
speak directly on how we dealt with Section 5 is when there were changes in the process, the authority was required to notify people that the changes had come. So I would get a letter in the mail that would say, on such and such and such, we're changing this, we're closing this, or whatever. But you were given that advance notice so that you could respond. You sometimes the changes, you just go, oh, this is minor, put it aside, it's not a big thing. Other things were bigger. So the pre-clearance was critically important because it gave you a chance to be alerted to these changes and assess whether or not those were significant to your community or not. And if they were, you could alert other people. And our tribal leaders would get them, we would get the letters, and that now since the Shelby County decision on that and the lack of the pre-clearance, we get no letters. We get no notification that this change is happening or that. And so it takes away the ability for us to respond. We believe in voting rights and these issues, that there's mutual responsibilities. There's responsibilities for us as Native leaders to do our part, and there's responsibilities for government. If we're not notified of the changes, we don't have the ability to exercise our responsibility. And as I mentioned in my testimony, it probably didn't elaborate because I know you know that, is our way of life creates a lot of barriers. I mean, we live in one of the largest land masses in the United States. We have tremendous diversity across our state, very remote and isolated communities. For us to do our responsibility to participate in this democracy, for us to do our responsibility to advise government when they make changes that things would have negative impacts, we're blocked from doing that. And then people say, well, how is this happening right now? Why are all these problems? It's not just bad people. It's not just ill-informed people. You're talking about peoples versus systems. You're talking about inertia that happens in these systems. You talk about perceived lack of funding where election officials say, we got to tighten our belts and make money stretch further on that. At the same time, they have money in an interest-bearing account that they could use to solve it. But the pressures on government to cut corners or to stretch funding further, real human beings make decisions based on those pressures. And often we're the ones that lose out on that. This emphasis on cost cutting. Again, the inertia, some of it is bureaucratic, some of it is people that are just tired of this stuff and have lost the spark and enthusiasm of what they're doing in their job and how exciting it is to be on the cutting edge on voting and empowering your people. And what we want to do is we want to exercise our responsibility. In order to exercise our responsibility on the pre-clearance, we need to be informed. So that's kind of a short answer, and I could fill that out in written comments on that, but that's a practical example.
Well, and I think it is a strong example, and I think we recognize that in a state, as you point out, where geography is massive, it's not just distances, it's distances that come about when you have limited communications access through broadband, when you don't have connectors by road. So there are many ways where you are literally cut off. So how you communicate is something that is clearly a challenge for us. I'm going to turn to Senator Smith and for her question.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chair, and to our chair as well. And thank you also to all of our panelists today. You provided to us a thorough and sobering review of the many challenges that Native voters experience as they attempt to exercise, as you attempt to exercise your freedom to vote, and the disparities that you are confronted with. I also appreciate the way in which you highlighted the particular trust and treaty responsibilities that we have to make sure that Native voters are able to access your freedom to vote. So I'd like to dive in on one general question and one specific question. I'm going to start with the specific question, which I'm going to direct to Ms. DeLeon. This has to do with vote by mail. So in Minnesota, we're quite fortunate to have accessible and secure vote by mail infrastructure, and Minnesotans rely on this option to vote safely and securely by Election Day. But of course, this strong vote-by-mail infrastructure relies on the Postal Service to deliver ballots to voters and to election officials on time. I've been quite concerned about this. I recently asked Postmaster General Louis DeJoy to explain how changes to first-class mail service that he is putting forth will impact tribal communities. And this is extremely important when it comes to voting access for Native people. Mail access, as many of you have described, is already quite difficult in some tribal communities, especially if homes are on tribal lands, don't have traditional addresses, as you pointed out, or if the nearest post office or P.O. box is miles and miles and miles away. So, Ms. DeLeon, could you talk about what we need to do, ways to improve access on tribal land to vote, to mail-in voting when it might not be fully accessible, and while voters are faced with relying on the Postal Service for speedy delivery, even as they're rolling back standards of service for first-class mail?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that, it's important to note that vote by mail is difficult because of the structural reasons that you described. And so what NAVRA does, which I think is the most practical solution, is it allows tribes to designate a building that has an address that can be used to register, pick up, and drop off ballots. And this is important because not only is that a familiar place for many tribal members, but it also gets rid of confusion, and it would be closer in a lot of instances than post offices that can be a significant distance away. And the nice thing is that they've actually recently implemented this exact system in Washington State that has a lot of experience with vote by mail, and that has been met with success as well. So NAVRA extends those provisions nationwide because, as you know, the problems with mail delivery in Indian country is a nationwide problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I completely agree with that. I just have a minute or two left, so I'm going to ask my broad question. As you have all shown today in your testimony, there are so many ways that Native people's access to voting is restricted. And so I'd like to just ask you, whomever on the panel, like, what do you think are the one or two most important things that the federal government could do to address these barriers for Native and tribal communities? And maybe let me just, I'll turn to Janet Davis, maybe to begin.
In our case, I think it's very important that there is federal law and that will make the tribes be able to have that access throughout everywhere, because as you know, even throughout right now, states provide different avenues and restrictions to voting. I would like to say in Nevada, Nevada has been very good. Like I said, they passed the state legislation. They're doing things on a state level to make access to our tribes. I think if other states could follow that example, and if this, your new law is voted into place, then that would actually help and designate states, other states to follow along as well. So
yeah,
that's my thought. I mean, to make it uniform across the board.
So if there
So
was basic national
pardon me. Yeah, national standard. So all states aren't doing what they want to do at all different levels. And I think that goes for all voting, even non-tribal. There has to be consistency throughout all of our land as well, to allow equal voting access for everyone, not only Native Americans, for that.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Chair, I believe I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith. Senator Daines.
Chairman, thank you. Well, first of all, let me state by saying that ensuring that all eligible voters can vote and they can be certain that their ballot counts is a goal that we all share on both sides of the aisle. But the Native American Voting Rights Act does not further the goal of free, fair, and secure elections. In fact, looking at Montana, we've had extraordinary levels of voter turnout. 81% in 2020, 72% in 2018, 74% in 2016. And in Montana, our legislature, our Secretary of State, and our governor took the necessary steps to ensure integrity of our elections going forward. But for months, my Democrat colleagues have felt compelled to mislead the truth and the facts about voting in Montana. So let me set the record straight. We put in place some common sense reforms that enjoy the support of the vast majority of Montanans, requiring photo ID. If you want to go get a library card at the library, you produce a photo ID. You want to buy a fishing license, you want to buy a hunting license, you produce a photo ID. That's so that every county, every tribe, every state can deal with the challenges that they uniquely face. The Native American Voting Rights Act contains a number of provisions that are ripe for fraud, such as sending unlimited absentee ballots to tribally designated public buildings rather than directly to the voter. In her written testimony, Ms. DeLeon talks about Montana's ballot harvesting plan, but she mischaracterizes the nature of this legislation and fails to acknowledge that Indian country widely supported a voter-passed ban on ballot harvesting in 2018. Go back and look at the specific precincts in Indian country, widely supported. First and foremost, the Montana law only bans people from being paid to collect ballots. It doesn't ban ballot collection in its entirety. Even the Carter-Baker Commission suggested that handling of absentee ballots should be limited, and the Supreme Court just this year noted there are a number of legitimate reasons to limit ballot harvesting. In Montana, we want everyone legally allowed to vote to be able to do so. And we want there to be zero doubt that those votes indeed will be counted. All Montanans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, should have faith in our elections. Mr. Leon, last week you testified in front of the Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. At that hearing, Senator Cruz rightly pointed out that no witnesses invited by the Democrats addressed any concerns with ballot harvesting. So to that point, What makes you so confident that no fraud will occur with paid ballot harvesters?
Thank you so much for that question. I'd like to make a couple of notes in response to your questions and your statements. First, while Montana has about 83% turnout, unfortunately in Native communities, that turnout is about 65%, so significantly lower. And in fact, in 2014, right before Montana was sued under Section 2 for its failure to provide on-reservation polling places, the turnout on reservations was about 30%. So this was in our very recent history that Montana was forced to place on-reservation polling places in an attempt to increase voter turnout. And that has increased, but it still lags behind those of the rest of Montana. As for the ballot collection law, I think that it's noteworthy that there was a previous ballot collection law, as you note, the 2018 initiative. Upon review, 5 tribes joined us in suing against that law, where we were successful in state court under the state's constitutional right to vote provision, where the ballot collection ban was found to be unconstitutional because of the burdens it placed on Native Americans. The most recent attempt to ban ballot collection, which would effectively make it so that organizations could not pick up and drop off ballots, was found to be, from the Montana Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, intentional discrimination on behalf of the Montana State Legislature. The reason that I'm so confident that fraud will not occur is because I can look at the past and history. I can see that there is no record of significant amount of fraud, and that in instances where fraud occurs, that is already prosecuted under laws that outlaw fraud. And I think that, if we have concerns about fraud, things like ballot tracking are significant steps that states can take to ensure ballot integrity when allowing state practices like ballot collection. I'll also note that NAVRA similarly includes a provision that says you cannot be paid for the number of ballots that are collected, but that organizations can still pay individuals for getting out and picking up and dropping off ballots, because it is a significant, takes a significant amount of time and it takes a significant amount of resources to collect and drop off ballots on vast Montana reservations. And that's what the most recent ballot collection ban would prohibit. And that's why we continue to challenge that law in state court.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Let me, Chairwoman Janet Davis, let me ask you this question, because I think this is important for purposes of what's happening in Nevada, to talk a little bit about why I support these voting right reforms. You mentioned AB4. And AB4, which was introduced and passed by our legislature, actually was later repealed, but it was replaced with AB 321 in the 2021 legislative sessions. And it made important reforms that impact our Native communities. One of those, is my understanding of the reform, was it took away the obstacles to picking up and dropping off mail, which is extremely common for Native Americans in Nevada. And in other words, to pick up and drop off the mail for one another, which would include the mail-in ballot. Can you talk a little bit? Why was that a barrier, and is that something our Native community supported?
Our Native communities support that. As you know, like for us, our postal office right now, we have the postmaster comes whenever they want. Right now we're dealing with, because we're a small community, if you see the lady's car down there, we race down there to check our mail. It has no set time frame for us to pick up mail. So the mail drop-off, ballot drop-off here that was at our administration building made it easy for people to vote to drop off their ballots. As you know, we all live in extended family housing where there is mother, daughter, brother, maybe an uncle, an aunt, able to help drop off that ballot. But the laws that were restricting that was only that person that voted could drop off their ballot. So when the laws were changed in the state of Nevada to allow the pickup of the ballots and the drop off, it made it more easy for our citizens, our community members to drop off their ballots.
Why was that important? Why was it important, instead of restricting just the individual who voted to drop off the ballot, to allow family members or others
because
to
you have
drop it off?
people that live, again, a great distance away that may not have a car, may not have the access to drop off ballots for whatever reason. It just made it easier, and it allowed for more people to cast their ballots. It is just made it more easy for everyone to
And to
allow
your,
them to vote.
thank you. And to your knowledge, was there fraud associated with that?
Oh, no, definitely not. I think everyone insists that there's fraud, but for Native Americans to vote, you do it because you want to cast your vote. You do it proudly. You're not going to fraud. We're trying to honor our ancestors by casting our votes. There is no fraud involved. There hasn't been, and in the past there hasn't been any fraud. So
And to my knowledge, not only there was a lawsuit that was filed against AB4. If I'm not mistaken, it was Donald J. Trump for president, Republican National Committee and Nevada Republican Party versus Barbara Sagaski, who is our Secretary of State and also happens to be a Republican. It was filed in the District Court for the District of Nevada, but it was eventually dismissed by the judge. And the judge said, not only have the challengers failed to allege a substantial risk of voter fraud, but the state has its own mechanisms for deterring and prosecuting voter fraud. So I think it is important that we do not get caught up in the partisanship and the politics, and we really focus, if we truly are going to work in a bipartisan way, to allow voters to vote in a manner that works for them. Wouldn't you agree with that?
That should be the ultimate goal of all parties involved. We do want people to vote. That should be ultimately why we are here today, for that matter. We want people to vote. We want to hear what they want. So, with that being said, I have to agree.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Ms. De Leon, simple question. Is voter fraud a concern in Indian country? Does it happen?
No, not in significant numbers. It's not been recorded. There haven't been instances of voter fraud of note in Indian country. There have been false accusations that have been successfully rebutted.
Can you give me a couple of examples, just very briefly, of allegations that have been proven to be false?
Sure. So, in South Dakota, following the election, a close election that was ultimately decided by Native voters, a congressional election, there was a rumor, a persistent rumor of, rampant fraud within the reservation. And in fact, 50 affidavits were submitted to that effect. Those were all investigated, and there was no finding of fraud. They were false allegations. And in fact, unfortunately, this implication that Indian country or that Native Americans are somehow incapable of running fair and safe elections is false and is damaging because Native Americans are trustworthy Americans that absolutely can and should run elections with integrity.
Thank you very much. Mr. Anthony, as you know, Hawaii consistently experiences low voter turnout, especially in districts where large numbers of Native Hawaiians live. Can you describe for the committee efforts to increase Native Hawaiian voter engagement, including Aloha Rising, No Vote, No Grumble, and what role Congress could play in helping to increase civic engagement among Native Hawaiians?
Sure, thank you for that question. I think certainly having the resource to be able to engage voters in Hawaii is necessary, not just during the voting cycle when there's a lot of activity, but also during other opportunities where we can engage in making sure that we see the reflection of ourselves in this idea that voter engagement is important to further the trajectory of engagement in Native Hawaiians. And I think, most simply, it goes to this idea that we need the resources to make sure that there is voter registration and that there's follow-up with some of the communities that are far out in rural areas, not unlike some of the descriptions that we've heard from other panelists today. And certainly, I think that it's critical, just to echo some of the other sentiments that we've heard by the other panelists, it's critical for us to engage in voting. And it's critical for us to encourage everyone, not only because we have a civic duty to do so, but because it is how we have the ability to come together as communities to make the best decisions for our places and our spaces. And so certainly the work that you're doing with Indian Affairs, I think is really important for all of our communities, but specifically, the funds available to make sure that everyone understands the rules of how this is done and the ways at which we can ask for our communities to engage is critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ferguson, Bonnie, what can we expect the impacts of the Brnovich decision to be on Native voters, and could the protections afforded Native voters under the Voting Rights Act be in doubt?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The Brnovich decision has thrown a wrench in the ability to bring Section 2 cases. Native American voters will have a harder time succeeding in filing claims under the Voting Rights Act, and they're severely impacted by the court's decision to adopt a de minimis impact factor because the Native American population is already small in Arizona, and reservation communities are a smaller subsection of an already small population. So that's a huge concern for the Native American community, the opportunity to bring a case that will withstand Section 2. And so, yes, addressing Section 2 by creating a standard for vote denial is very important to the ability to uphold the purpose of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you very much. Senator Lujan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you and the Vice Chair for the markup earlier and the passage of legislation more appropriately, and also this important hearing. Native Americans have the lowest voting rate of any American racial or ethnic group, an outgrowth of having one of the lowest voter registration rates in the United States as well. Mr. Payment, what percentage of Native Americans are not registered to vote?
Okay, I'm glad I get a question. Thank you, Senator, and thank you again for introducing the legislation. And so we have some updated data from the U.S. Census. There's about 7 million eligible Native voters across the country, and about 34%, our best estimate is about 34% remain unregistered to vote.
And Mr. Payment, you answered my next question, which is what that number translates to. You said there's about 7 million. So is that approximately 2.4 million that would equate to that 34% that are not registered to vote?
Yes. Yes.
Now, Ms. De Leon, you mentioned that Native Americans face many obstacles to voting, but I also want to highlight these obstacles are different from those faced by other language and ethnic minorities. Ms. De Leon, yes or no, do Native Americans face unique obstacles to voting that are not fully addressed in S1 and require more tailored legislation like the Native American Voting Rights Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to adequately address?
Yes, absolutely.
And Ms. Ferguson, Bonnie, some have characterized my legislation as an attempt to federalize elections for Native voters. But the Constitution affirms that the federal government has a unique obligation to protect Native voting rights. Ms. Ferguson, Bonnie, yes or no, does the Constitution grant Congress broad powers to legislate on the rights of Native voters under the authority granted in the Indian Commerce Clause, the Elections Clause, the Treaty Clause, and Congress's plenary authority?
Yes, definitely. And Congress has exercised that in various areas.
Now, again, some have questioned whether the provisions of the Native American voting rights are unfunded mandates. Ms. De Leon, yes or no, isn't it true that the $10 million grant program in the legislation would help with administering the requirements and help American Vote Act funding is available to help with the hard costs associated with running elections?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Now, some also have questioned the ability of states and precincts to administer the legislation, but we have examples in Washington State and in Nevada where we see provisions of the Native American Voting Rights Act being implemented with success. For example, Nevada got rid of ballot collection bans and has mandated polling locations on tribal lands. Ms. Davis, yes or no, have these changes increased Native voter access?
Yes, it has, definitely.
And Ms. Davis, yes or no, in the instance of ballot collection, and has there been any fraud or security problems to your knowledge in Nevada?
No, there hasn't been, and actually it was challenged and it failed. So no, definitely not.
And I wanted to bring attention to that particular question because there was a question raised in the previous hearing in judiciary about that. So that's an important answer responding to that concern. Now, while 84% of the United States population lives in urban areas, the majority of Native Americans and Alaska Natives live in rural communities on or near their tribal homelands, which often lack polling places. Ms. Ferguson, Bonnie, yes or no, currently, do you see large disparities in access to polling location between voters living on tribal lands and those living off tribal lands?
Yes, tribal voters definitely have less access to polling locations and in-person early voting locations.
And Ms. Ferguson, Bonnie, yes or no, would you agree that the Native American Voting Rights Act would secure equitable access to polling places on tribal lands by ensuring a minimum of one polling location per precinct on tribal lands?
Yes, but just in addition, there's also a provision for larger tribes to request additional polling locations.
And Mr. Payment, geographical isolation and the lack of mailing addresses hinder Native voters from accessing the ballot because traditional addresses are needed to obtain non-tribal identification for voter registration. Mr. Payment, for many Native Americans, how far must one travel to get to the nearest DMV or obtain non-tribal identification?
So, Senator, you heard my testimony, but you also heard from several of us today that it seems like a common occurrence that it's at least up to an hour to drive to the DMV or Social Security office to register to vote, and in some cases, it's almost as long to travel to get to poll sites as well.
I appreciate that very much. And Mr. Chairman, I have many other questions, but I'll submit them into the record as well. And just very much appreciate the testimony of everyone here today. I hope this is an area that we can find some common ground, work together. But again, this legislation, as much as I'd like to take credit for it, wasn't my idea. This was a result of Native American voting rights advocates coming to work with me to present the importance of getting this done. And that's why there's over 30 organizations, including every known prominent Native American organizations that represent tribes from across the United States that have endorsed this legislation. So I'm hopeful and prayerful that we can get this across the finish line. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Lujan, and thank you very much for your leadership in this space. We need it, and your bipartisan attitude and your determination on behalf of all Native peoples really helps us to advance this cause. Vice Chair Murkowski.
Thank you, and I too want to thank you, Senator, for your leadership on this. I want to pick up Mr. Payment where Senator Lujan left off with the identification. Access to Department of Motor Vehicles in Alaska in way too many of our communities is not possible. We don't have the DMV there, and there's no road out. So you want to go get your license, you fly to a larger community. So I want to ask you, Mr. Payment, the importance of the ability for Native Americans to use tribally issued ID cards. And can you speak to the concerns that others have raised about any security issues that present themselves with regards to validity of tribally issued identification cards?
Absolutely, Senator, and I have a high respect for you as one of our U.S. senators and a close affiliation with our Alaska Native people. The conditions they live in are very similar, but more remote and more challenging than my community. I did bring my tribal card to show you. It's an old one, so you can see my hair is black in this picture.
Doesn't look anything like
security...
you.
Well, and my hair is a little bit shorter, but
Yeah.
we have a security strip on the back. And tribes are very guarded with our tribal cards. There's issues of per capita, there's issues of membership services and identification, such that our identification cards are no less stringent than, say, the state's process. And so the intimation from some that somehow we're less than either to conduct our own registration to vote or to have poll sites or to issue our own cards. These are legitimate cards that are equal to state driver's license. And again, to see the strip, it's got data on the back of it and the security strip. So we have very secure tribal ID cards to identify who we are as members, as citizens of our tribe.
I appreciate that. Let me ask. This was a question that was directed. I believe it was directed to Ms. De Leon just a moment ago about the issue of unfunded mandates. One of the concerns that we've heard about the Native American Voting Rights Act is that it is an unfunded mandate on states. There is funding authorized, and I guess I would ask you if you are concerned about this aspect of the legislation. Can you identify what types of costs may be associated with some of the requirements that are called for, and what resources are available to states and tribes to implement some of the provisions under the Act?
Thank you so much, Senator, for I think a really thoughtful question. I think we should start the conversation by just acknowledging that states have been failing their financial obligations to Native citizens. And so, I think that states, unfortunately, have been very inequitable in the amount of money that they're willing to spend on tribal citizens. And so they're acting a bit in a deficit there. But there are funds available. So as you mentioned, the grant program itself is funded, which will help with the transition. It also helps with the language access provisions and also helps with poll worker training, so some of the technical aspects. As for the hard costs of starting a polling place, such as the need to buy some polling machines, to again train workers, those can be, you can use HAVA funding in order to pay for those costs. And we've seen satellite offices in places like South Dakota and Montana use satellite offices in order to, meet the hard costs of starting a polling location in Indian country. And I'll also say that the costs themselves aren't overwhelming. For a polling place, once you've acquired the machines, it's really about the labor of manning a polling place. But relative to state budgets and the like, it's a relatively small. So I think Ms. Ferguson Bonnie mentioned that in the Pasquayaki Reservation, it would have cost about $5,000 to run the polling place, but the state spent $180,000 fighting against it. So, we're not talking about overwhelming sums of money, and there is quite a bit of HAVA funding available throughout the country. There's a surplus. In states like Alaska, there's over $1 million. In states like Montana and South Dakota, there's over $1 million. And HAVA funding has different tiers. And those different tiers can be used for some of these hard costs. So there are available funds.
Well, and I'm going to turn to you, Julie. obviously, there are costs that that are incurred when you are not only establishing the polling place, but then making sure that it is appropriately staffed with the trained poll workers. And so, as we look to different ways to make sure that there is greater access and fair and equitable access, we know that it's going to require more of those who are willing to step forward and be that poll worker. And I know that in many of our villages, that has been the greatest challenge, is to get sufficient people to basically work in the polling places. And so I look at some of the provisions that are included within both the John Lewis Voting Rights Act as well as the NAVRA, and a recognition that we're going to have to be training and bringing on more to ensure that these polling places are open. So I'd like your comment to that. But while I have you up and recognizing that I'm over my time already, I want you to also address the issue that we've heard from the state of Alaska about concerns that ballots must be postmarked the day they're received at a postal facility located on Indian lands. We know that in Alaska, our mail delivery is oftentimes less than reliable, and that's probably putting it politely there. So that is something that we're looking within the legislation here as to how we might be able to address that. But just two concerns here that I've raised. First is our ability to be able to find and train and so we're adequately staffing the polling places, particularly in some of these very small remote communities. And then also the concern about this provision that says that ballots have to be postmarked the day that they are received at the postal facility. So if you can speak to those two.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. Especially during this pandemic, it has been really hard to get poll workers on that. People have been spooked by the disease and the contagiousness on that. And so it has been difficult during this pandemic to get people. But I want to describe real quickly the desire for people to help out is there. When we helped the state a number of years ago, when they said there wasn't any communities that wanted early voting spots, and we deployed a small group of people to contact them, we got 50 villages within just a matter of a couple days of people wanting to have that. We had have them work with the state, fill out a form, email it back. We had one elder in one of our communities that didn't have a car, didn't have a four-wheeler, that walked miles to get to the tribal hall on that, to be able to use their internet, to fill out the form, to have an open voting area for her village on that. The desire for people to have early voting and polling spots that are accessible to our people is there. It's overcoming the barriers and also making sure that there's equities. You know, I said in my testimony that when we had all these early voting spots, the state says, well, we'll offer you an honorarium. And people are working hours and hours for the honorarium, and the honorarium was $100 for the whole time on that. When we calculated out how much that was, people were paid 15 cents an hour. And it's not the money, it's the lack of equity and the lack of respect for people wanting to commit their time to do it. At the same time, in the urban areas, they were hiring more people to build up their operations to handle that, and they were paying them all $15 an hour. It was the inequity. It's not that people don't want to help out, that people don't want to volunteer, that don't want to go to that extra effort. We found in our early voting process tremendous desire for people to help out, participate. But I do think we're going to have added burdens with this pandemic as people get spooked by the contagiousness of the pandemic. And your second question?
This was on the language in the bill currently that says that ballots have to be postmarked the day they're received at a postal facility, and just the concerns that we have with reliability of a postal service when you've got weather issues, and just the challenges of getting mail in and out of villages.
Yes, no, there is no doubt that we have storms all the time, which change things. We have a lot of dedicated people trying to deliver mail, but you can't take it to the bank. It's many obstacles, many things fall through the cracks, things you cannot require the date stamp on that to make that work.
Okay, we'll look at addressing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm not going to have a question to be able to ask, but a couple of comments and things that I want to be able to mention. First off, I want to say thank you to all the witnesses that are coming. I've appreciated being able to listen in and to be a part of the dialogue today to be able to get some additional background on this. So I appreciate very much your engagement and for what you're doing to be able to make sure every person has not only the opportunity to vote, but the ability to be able to vote in America. That is essential to who we are as Americans, that everyone has that opportunity and that ability to be able to get their vote in. So thanks for that engagement. We need folks that are continuing to be able to speak out for every single person across the country to be able to have that opportunity and ability to be able to vote. There's some questions that I'm going to continue to be able to go through. Oklahoma is unique in some ways in Indian country and how that actually works for us. The definitions that are in this particular bill, as I'm going through it and trying to do some additional research, seems to would take in almost the entire state, if not the entire state of Oklahoma, because we have some areas of reservation, some areas of non-reservation, some tribal areas that are listed as non-reservation tribal areas. And so we're trying to figure out this all-encompassing definition and what that would cause in the interaction between the states and the tribes and how that would actually operate there. This has been an area that we've been very, very engaged in Oklahoma and have not had issues, thankfully, of opportunities and ability for individuals to be able to vote in Oklahoma from tribal areas. And so we'll continue to be able to research and be able to drill down this, but it could have a pretty far-reaching effect in Oklahoma in particular for some of the new definitions as well. So we're being very, very attentive to that. Some of the changes that are also in the bill as well on how it would handle some of the issues like the drop boxes, what that would look like in every part of my state, what that would work with ballot harvesting, and if that would then compel that or allow that when that's not in our state law, has not been an issue in our state and has been something we've been very protective of, and how we actually handle absentee ballots. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be able to vote early and everyone has the opportunity to be able to vote in person, or we have a no excuse absentee as well. But this would change that structure for everyone in our state. And so I'm very attuned to that. To be able to make sure that we still have a basic function of how we're operating as a state in all of our voting issues. The John Lewis bill that this appears to be moving with also has an uncertainty for pre-clearance. Currently, Oklahoma is not a pre-clearance state, was not historically a pre-clearance state, did not have the same issues that some other states did in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So we were not included in that. It's still uncertain if we would now be looped into becoming a pre-clearance state because of the uncertainty of those definitions in the John Lewis voting rights bill, because we don't know on what state suddenly becomes a pre-clearance and what does not based on how the definition is done. The federal observers, we don't know how that actually works and operates to suddenly have federal observers that are coming into our state elections. And then the consent decrees or settlements that have been done in the past that appear to be something that would suddenly be the state in the future would be punished for, when typically a consent decree or settlement, when it's done on a voting issue, it resolves the issue and moves on. The John Lewis bill reaches back 25 years and looks back to see anything that was done in the past, and it may cause consequences for the future on that. So trying to be attentive to all those things. So I've got quite a few concerns that we're walking through on the days ahead on this, and some issues that do need to be resolved, especially with the uniqueness of where we are as a state, but also to be able to continue to make sure that states and local areas are able to stay very, very engaged in the unique issues. As everyone on this group knows, Alaska is different than Oklahoma, is different than New York State or California or North Dakota or Arizona or Nevada. And we want to be able to make sure that every person has the opportunity and ability to be able to vote and that it works well for every person there. So again, thanks again for your engagement. Thanks for allowing me to be able to listen in today.
Thank you. If there are no more questions for our witnesses, members may also submit follow-up written questions for the record. We want to thank all of our panelists for taking the better part of an afternoon, and for some of you, the morning. The hearing record will be open for 2 weeks, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for their time and their testimony. This hearing is now adjourned.